All right, welcome in everyone, ready for another deep dive. Today, we're taking a trip to France's Loire Valley, and specifically, we're getting to know a grape called Melon de Bourgogne.
Melon de Bourgogne.
It might not be a household name like, say, Cabernet Sauvignon or Chardonnay, but stick with us.
Oh, trust me, there's a lot more to this grape than meets the eye. We've got a ton of fascinating information to share.
We're talking about its history, the terroir, the whole process from vine to wine, and of course, what it tastes like and what you should be eating with it, all that good stuff.
We really want to equip you, the listener, to understand what makes this grape so special. We're not just dropping facts, we're aiming for those aha moments.
Exactly. We want you to come away from this feeling like you've really unlocked the secrets of Melon de Bourgogne.
And maybe even a little inspired to seek out a bottle or two.
So think of this as your express lane to becoming a Melon de Bourgogne aficionado. No PhD required. Now, one of the things that makes this grape so interesting is that it's almost like a blank canvas, right?
Yeah, it really is. Melon de Bourgogne has this amazing ability to reflect the place where it's grown. It picks up the nuances of the soil, the climate, all those things that contribute to terroir.
It lets the place speak through the wine. But here's the thing. While Melon de Bourgogne might have some ancestral ties to the famed Burgundy region, it truly found its home in the Loire Valley.
And the story of how it got there is pretty wild. It involves a bit of historical intrigue, a thirst for brandy, and some clever Dutch traders.
Oh, that sounds juicy. Let's rewind a bit, though. Where does this grape, Melon de Bourgogne, actually trace its roots to?
Well, the name kind of gives it away, Melon de Bourgogne. It likely originated in Burgundy, where it was known by simpler names, like just Melon or sometimes Gamay Blanc.
But if it started in such a prestigious wine region, why isn't it a star there like, say, Chardonnay or Pinot Noir?
That's a good question. Burgundy is known for its big, bold Chardonnays, those rich, oaky whites. And on the red side, it's all about the elegant structure of Pinot Noir.
Right, the heavy hitters.
Exactly. Melon de Bourgogne, especially when it's young, tends to produce wines that are a bit lighter in body. The flavors are more subtle, more delicate. It didn't quite fit the mold of what Burgundy was famous for.
So it was kind of the underdog, the wallflower at the Burgundy party. So how did it make its way to the Loire Valley?
So this is where the Dutch traders come in. Back in the 16th and 17th centuries, they had a huge demand for brandy.
Brandy, the spirit distilled from wine.
Exactly. And they needed a lot of wine to make that brandy. They were looking for a grape that was productive, relatively neutral in flavor, and that could handle being distilled. Melon de Bourgogne fit the bill perfectly.
So it was more about quantity over quality at that point.
In a way, yes. It was a workhorse grape, perfect for churning out the base wine for brandy. But as Melon de Bourgogne settled into the Loire Valley, the local winemakers started to realize it had potential beyond just distillation. They saw that it could make some pretty delicious wine on its own.
And that's when Muscadet was born, right?
You got it. The creation of the Muscadet AOC, which stands for Appellation d'Origine Contrôlée, was a turning point. It gave Melon de Bourgogne a real sense of place and identity in the Loire Valley.
And Muscadet isn't just one big area, right? There are different subregions within it.
You're right. There are a few key subregions within Muscadet, each with its own personality. The most famous is Muscadet, Sèvres, and Maine.
That's the one I hear about most often.
Yeah, and they often use a special technique there called sur-lie.
Oh, we'll get to that. We'll definitely break that down.
Absolutely. Then you have Muscadet Côte de Grand Loup, which tends to produce wines there a bit richer, a bit more structured, and can age for a while. This is partly because it has a slightly warmer microclimate and some patches of clay limestone soil. And finally, you've got Muscadet Coteau de la Loire. It's a bit further inland and tends to make wines that are lighter and super fruity, meant to be enjoyed young.
Okay, so we've got these distinct subregions. But what does the AOC actually mean? It's more than just a name, right?
Right, it's a whole system of rules and regulations. Think of it as a quality control measure. The AOC dictates things like which grape varieties can be used, and in this case, it's primarily Melon de Bourgogne, how the vines can be grown, the minimum alcohol level, and a whole bunch of other stuff. It's all about protecting the integrity of the wines and making sure they represent their specific place of origin.
So it's like a guarantee of authenticity and a certain level of quality.
Precisely. Now, before we dive into the nitty-gritty of how these grapes were actually grown, let's not forget that Melon de Bourgogne has had its share of challenges along the way. Just like a lot of European vineyards, the Muscadet region was hit hard by the phylloxera epidemic back in the late 1800s.
Ah, that tiny but mighty pest that nearly wiped out European winemaking.
Exactly. Luckily, they found a way to combat it by grafting the European vines onto resistant American rootstock. And then there were economic ups and downs, changes in consumer tastes. It's been a bit of a roller coaster ride. But through it all, the producers in Muscadet have shown incredible resilience. They've adapted, they've innovated, and they've really focused on quality. Especially in recent years, there's been a real surge of interest in Muscadet. You could call it a renaissance.
A Melon de Bourgogne revival. So what's driving that renewed interest?
Well, there's a growing appreciation for dry, crisp, mineral-driven white wines, and that's exactly what Melon de Bourgogne does well. It's also a great value for the money. And its affinity for seafood, which we'll talk more about later, is really resonating with today's food trends. Plus, there's some amazing producers in Muscadet who are really pushing the boundaries and crafting some truly exceptional wines.
It sounds like there's a lot to be excited about. Okay, let's shift gears and talk about the place where it all begins, the terroir. You mentioned an Atlantic climate. How does that impact the grapes?
The proximity to the Atlantic Ocean has a huge influence on the climate in Muscadet. The winters are mild, the summers are relatively cool compared to more inland regions, and there's a good amount of rainfall throughout the year.
So it's not exactly a Mediterranean paradise.
No, it's definitely more on the brisk side, but those cool, wet conditions are actually crucial for Melon de Bourgogne. The cool temperatures and sea breezes help the grapes retain their acidity, which is a hallmark of Muscadet wines. And those refreshing breezes also help to prevent fungal diseases, which can be a problem in humid environments.
So it's a climate that keeps the grapes on their toes, so to speak. And what about the soil? We always hear about soil being so important in winemaking. What's special about the soils in Muscadet?
Well, the soils are incredibly diverse in Muscadet, which is one of the reasons why you get such a range of styles within the region. One of the key soil types is granite,
Granite, like the stuff countertops are made of.
the very same. But in the vineyard, granite imparts some really unique qualities to the wine. Wines grown on granite tend to be super elegant, with a really vibrant acidity and a pronounced minerality. They often have this like flinty, stony quality that some people describe as wet stone.
Wow, wet stone. That's a pretty vivid descriptor.
Yeah, it's a way of capturing that earthy, almost saline quality you sometimes get in Muscadet. But granite isn't the only star player in the soil lineup. There's also schist, which is a type of metamorphic rock that's really good at retaining heat.
So it's like a natural heater for the vine.
Exactly. And that extra warmth helps the grapes develop more aromatic complexity. You might get hints of spice, dried herbs, and even a little bit of richness on the palate. But schist doesn't make the wines heavy or flabby. They still retain that lovely freshness that's so characteristic of Muscadet. And we've got gneiss, another type of metamorphic rock. It's known for good drainage, which is important in a region that gets a decent amount of rain. And gneiss also contributes to the minerality of the wines, often adding a touch of salinity, that kind of seashell-like note.
So all these different soils are like the foundation of Muscadet. They give the wines their backbone, their sense of place.
Exactly. You'll often hear Muscadet wines described as having a mineral backbone, and that's really thanks to the diversity of soils in the region. They contribute those earthy, saline, sometimes almost chalky notes that make these wines so unique.
And how do these soil differences play out in those subregions we talked about earlier?
Well, Muscadet Sèvres-les-Maines, the biggest of the subregions, has a real mix of all these soil types, which helps explain why you find such a variety of styles there. In Muscadet Côte de la Loire, the soils are generally lighter, so the wines tend to be a bit more upfront with their fruit and have a really pure expression. And in Muscadet Côte de Grandlieu, you have a mix of soils, including some clay and limestone, which, along with a slightly warmer climate, help create wines that are richer, have a bit more structure, and age well.
It's amazing how these subtle variations in the soil can have such a profound impact on the wine. It all comes back to that idea of Melon de Bourgogne being like a blank canvas. It lets the terroir really shine through.
Absolutely. It's a grape that's all about subtlety and nuance, about reflecting the place where it's grown. You get those mineral notes, that fresh acidity, that touch of the sea. It's a true expression of the Loire Valley.
All right, so we've covered the climate, the soil. Now let's move on to what happens in the vineyard, the actual grape growing part. What can you tell us about Melon de Bourgogne vines and how they're managed?
Well, every grape variety has its own quirks, its own personality, and that extends to things like the shape of the leaves and the way the grape clusters form. It's like each variety has its own fingerprint. And then there's the annual growing cycle in Muscadet, which starts with bud break in the spring and culminates with harvest in the fall. Each stage of that cycle requires careful attention and management.
It's a year-round commitment. What are some of the key practices that vine growers in Muscadet focus on?
Well, pruning is essential. It's all about controlling the yield, making sure the vines aren't producing too many grapes, which can dilute the flavors. They often use short pruning methods like guillot to achieve that. Then you have training systems, which use wires and posts to support the vines and make sure they're getting optimal sunlight. And soil management is huge. A lot of growers are really focusing on organic practices, enriching the soil with compost, using cover crops, and basically treating the soil like the living ecosystem that it is.
It's about nurturing the land.
Absolutely. And then there's canopy management. This involves things like strategically removing leaves to make sure there's good air circulation and sunlight penetration in the vineyard, which helps prevent disease and ripen the grapes evenly. And more, we're seeing a strong emphasis on sustainability and organic farming in Muscadet. It's all about working in harmony with nature.
It sounds like a lot of meticulous work, a lot of attention to detail. What are some of the specific challenges that vine growers in Muscadet face?
Well, because of that Atlantic climate we talked about, frost can be a real threat, especially in the spring when the buds are just starting to emerge. Growers have to be really vigilant about protecting their vines from frost damage. They might use things like wind machines to circulate the air and prevent frost from settling, or even sprinklers to create a protective layer of ice around the buds.
So it's a bit of a battle against the elements.
It can be. And then there's the humidity. That damp Atlantic climate makes the vines more susceptible to fungal diseases like downy mildew and powdery mildew. Growers have to carefully manage those diseases using copper and sulfur-based treatments and systemic fungicides when absolutely necessary. And like all wine regions around the world, Muscadet is facing the impacts of climate change.
Rising temperatures, changes in rainfall patterns, all that.
Exactly. And those changes can affect things like ripening times and the acidity levels in the grapes. Growers are having to adapt, experimenting with different clones of Melon de Bourgogne that might be better suited to warmer conditions, and adjusting their vineyard practices.
So there's a lot of adaptation and innovation happening in the vineyards. Okay, let's follow those grapes from the vineyard to the winery. What can you tell us about how Melon de Bourgogne is transformed into wine?
Well, there are a lot of traditional and modern techniques that come into play in Muscadet winemaking. But there's one technique that really stands out as the hallmark of the region. Surly.
Surly. We've heard that term a few times now. Let's break it down. What exactly does surly mean?
It's French for on the lees. The lees are basically the dead yeast cells that settle to the bottom of the tank after fermentation. In most white wines, you'd typically rack the wine off the lees pretty quickly. But in Muscadet, with the surly method, the wine is intentionally left in contact with those lees for an extended period of time. It could be for months, sometimes even over a year.
So it's like the wine gets a little spa treatment, a nice long bath with the yeast sediment?
In a way, yeah. And it has a really profound effect on the wine. The lees add richness and texture, they bring out more complex aromas, and they even contribute to the wine's ability to age.
What kind of aromas and textures are we talking about specifically?
Well, sur-lie aging can give the wine these lovely notes of bread dough, brioche, sometimes a hint of nuts, and even a slightly creamy texture. It rounds out the wine, gives more body, and really adds another layer of complexity.
So sur-lie is almost like a secret weapon in the winemaker's arsenal.
Absolutely. And for the Muscadet, Sèvres, and Maine-sur-Lie wines, there are even specific regulations about how long the wines have to be aged on the lees. It's a real point of pride for the region.
So it's not just some random technique. It's deeply ingrained in the tradition of Muscadet. What about other winemaking techniques? Are there other things that winemakers do to shape the character of Melon de Bourgogne?
Definitely. While sur-lie is the most iconic, there are other things that can be done. Some winemakers might use a little bit of skin contact or maceration before fermentation to extract more aromas and flavors from the grape skins. And temperature control during fermentation is really important. Cooler temperatures help preserve the freshness and delicate aromas of Melon de Bourgogne.
So it's about coaxing out those subtle flavors.
Exactly. And more winemakers are using indigenous yeasts for fermentation.
Remind me, what are indigenous yeasts again?
They're the yeasts that naturally occur in the vineyard as opposed to commercially cultivated yeasts. The idea is that by using these native yeasts, you can get a more authentic expression of the terroir, a wine that really reflects the unique character of that specific place. It can add another layer of complexity and nuance.
It's like capturing the essence of the vineyard.
Precisely. Now, malolactic fermentation, which converts malic acid to lactic acid and softens the acidity of the wine, is less common in Muscadet. That vibrant acidity is considered one of the grape's defining features, so you want to preserve that. But some winemakers might do a partial malolactic fermentation in certain vintages to round out the wine a bit. And while it's not traditional, some winemakers are even experimenting with aging Melon de Bourgogne in oak barrels. But they typically use older, neutral oak that won't impart too much oaky flavor. The idea is just to add a little bit of structure and complexity.
So there's a lot of experimentation happening, but always with respect for the grape's natural character. It sounds like the winemaker has a really important role to play.
Oh, absolutely. The winemaker is like the conductor of an orchestra. They have to balance all these different elements, the acidity, the minerality, the texture from sur lie aging, and guide the wine towards its full potential.
It's a real art form. Okay, so we followed the grapes from the vineyard through the winery, and now they're finally in the bottle. What does Melon de Bourgogne actually smell and taste like?
Well, Melon de Bourgogne is known for its delicate, nuanced aromas and flavors. It's not a fruit bomb or anything like that. It's more about subtlety and finesse. You might get aromas of citrus fruits, lemon, lime, grapefruit, along with white fruits like green apple, pear, white plum. Sometimes there are delicate floral notes like elderflower or acacia.
It sounds very fresh and spring-like.
It is. But the real hallmark of Melon de Bourgogne, especially Muscadet, is that saline minerality. It's often described as having aromas of oyster shells, sea breeze, wet stones. It's that unmistakable taste of the Atlantic.
That maritime influence really comes through, and in the sur lie aged wines, you get those additional notes of bread dough, brioche, and nuts, right?
Exactly. So you have this interplay of fresh fruit, subtle floral notes, and then that underlying minerality, which can be really pronounced. And if the wine has been aged sur lie, you get that added layer of complexity.
And what about the taste on the palate? What does Melon de Bourgogne feel like in the mouth?
It's typically very dry, crisp, and refreshing with a nice zesty acidity. The flavors often mirror the aromas, with that saline minerality really taking center stage. Some wines might have a subtle bitter note on the finish, which adds complexity. It's usually light to medium-bodied, so it's not a heavy wine. It's very approachable and easy to drink.
It sounds perfect for a warm summer day.
Absolutely. It's a great wine to just chill out with. And you mentioned different wine styles earlier. There are definitely some variations in how Melon de Bourgogne can present itself.
Yeah, let's talk about that. How would you describe the different styles?
You have the young, fresh styles that are bottled fairly quickly after fermentation. They're all about capturing that vibrant fruit and minerality. They're meant to be enjoyed young when that freshness is at its peak. And then you have the sur lie aged wines, which, as we discussed, have more texture, more complexity, and often a bit more body. Those wines can age for a while and develop some really interesting flavors over time.
So there's something for everyone, whether you're looking for a light, crisp aperitif or something with a bit more depth and complexity.
Exactly. And it all comes back to the terroir and the choices the winemaker makes. The climate, the soil, the winemaking techniques. They all contribute to the final expression of the wine.
So if someone's listening to this and thinking, okay, I need to try some Melon de Bourgogne, do you have any tasting tips for them?
Definitely. Pay attention to the serving temperature. For those young, fresh styles, you want to serve them well chilled. But for the sur lie wines, you can let them warm up a little bit, just to room temperature, to let those aromas and flavors really open up. And use a decent wine glass. You don't need anything fancy, but something with a slightly tapered rim will help concentrate the aromas. And when you're tasting, really focus on that minerality, that saline quality, and appreciate that refreshing acidity. And don't be afraid to try different producers and styles. There's a lot of diversity within Melon de Bourgogne.
It's all about exploration and finding what you like. Okay, let's talk food pairings. I know the classic pairing for Muscadet is oysters, but what makes that such a perfect match?
It's a classic for a reason. The acidity in the wine cuts through the richness of the oyster, and the wine's inherent salinity complements the briny flavor of the seafood. It's just a beautiful synergy.
It's like they were made for each other. But oysters aren't the only thing that pairs well with Melon de Bourgogne, right?
No, not at all. Melon de Bourgogne is incredibly versatile. It goes great with all sorts of seafood. Think lean white fish like cod or sole, grilled or baked. It can even handle richer fish like salmon or tuna, especially if they're prepared in a lighter style. Shellfish is a natural pairing, shrimp, lobster, scallops, and it's not just seafood.
Oh, tell me more.
It can work well with lighter poultry dishes, chicken, turkey, and that acidity can cut through creamy sauces. It's delicious with fresh green salads, grilled vegetables, fresh goat cheese. It can even complement certain Asian cuisines like sushi or sashimi, or dishes with ginger and soy sauce, and some people even like it with fresh fruit or fruit tarts.
Wow, that's way more versatile than I would have imagined. What's the secret? Why does it go with so many different things?
I think it comes down to that balance of acidity and minerality. The acidity cleanses the palate, balances richness, and the minerality adds depth and complexity. It's a wine that can really elevate a dish without overpowering it.
It's like the perfect supporting actor.
Exactly. And, there are no hard and fast rules when it comes to wine pairing. It's all about experimenting and finding what you like.
So be adventurous, try different things. Okay, last but not least, let's talk about the big picture. What's the current state of Melon de Bourgogne in the wine world?
Well, the AOC Muscadet is really the heart and soul of Melon de Bourgogne. It's what protects the quality, the authenticity, the regional identity of these wines. And those sub-denominations within Muscadet Sèvres Maine, Côte de Grand Lieu, Côte de la Loire are becoming more and more important as people start to appreciate the nuances of different terroirs.
And are there any specific producers or wines that you think really exemplify what Melon de Bourgogne can do?
Oh, there are so many great producers in Muscadet right now. Domaine de la Pépinière, with Marc Olivier at the helm, is doing some incredible things with organic and biodynamic farming. Their Clos de Brière and Granite de Clisson are iconic. Then you have Domaine Luno Pampa, a family-run estate with a focus on sustainability. Their Eldor and Terre de Pierre are really special. Domaine de l'Écu, led by Frédéric Niger, is another pioneer in biodynamic viticulture. Their Orthonius and Nice de Savonnet really showcase the terroir. Domaine Jo Landron is another one to look out for. They're all about organic and biodynamic farming, and their atmospheres and Fif du Braille are fantastic. And the historic Chateau Thébault, run by the Chiraud family, is known for its consistently high quality and classic muscat style.
It's inspiring to hear about all these passionate producers who are really pushing the boundaries of what Melon de Bourgogne can achieve, but what are some of the challenges that lie ahead for this grape?
Well, one of the biggest challenges is overcoming the perception that Muscadet is a simple, one-dimensional wine. There's this idea that it's just a light, easy-drinking wine and that's it. But as we've discussed, there's so much more to it than that, especially with these Sur Lie aged wines and the wines that are really expressing the terroir.
It's about getting people to see beyond the surface.
Exactly. And then there's competition from other wine regions and grape varieties. There are a lot of delicious, affordable white wines out there. So Muscadet producers have to work hard to stand out and tell their story. And climate change is a concern. Maintaining that acidity, which is so crucial for Melon de Bourgogne, is going to be a challenge as temperatures rise.
So there's a lot to think about.
There is. But overall, I think the future is bright for Melon de Bourgogne. There's a growing appreciation for these kinds of wines, dry, fresh, mineral-driven. And there are so many talented producers who are passionate about showcasing what this grape can do.
It's a grape with a rich history, a unique character, and a lot of potential. So what's the takeaway for our listeners? What do you want them to remember about Melon de Bourgogne?
I want them to remember that it's a grape that's worth exploring, that it has a lot more to offer than you might initially think. It's a grape that's deeply connected to its place of origin, that reflects the terroir of the Loire Valley in a really beautiful way. It's a grape that's incredibly versatile with food and that can age and develop some really fascinating complexity.
It's a grape that deserves its moment in the spotlight.
Absolutely. So go out there, find a bottle of Muscadet, maybe try one that's been aged Sur Lie. See for yourself what all the fuss is about.
And who knows, you might just discover your new favorite wine. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Cheers to that.